Here we go.
There we go. So hi.
Hi.
To start off with, would you like to just say your name and where you are?
Yes, my name is Ken Hutchinson. I'm a psychologist and a Gestalt therapist in Santa Maria, California.
Okay. Well, as you may know, the first question that I have for you is, who are you as a human being? And that would have to do maybe with your interests, your qualities, your values, just who you really are.
Yeah, I've been pondering how to answer that. Had a number of profound experiences that shaped shaped a worldview for me that kind of it's a more of a spiritual perspective. I was raised Catholic. I was an altar boy, and I had some really profound experiences as an altar boy. The Catholic Church. I mean, I never really talked about it, but that's not what they promote. It's not what they're trying to create for people. At least that wasn't what I was taught as a kid. Uh, and I was a practicing Catholic for until probably my sophomore year in college. My freshman year, I was still practicing. But I had this internal sense of this experience of something bigger that was in the world, that was part of me, but was bigger than me. And a number of my college buddies began a meditation practice. And my senior year in college, I started that practice as well, transcendental meditation. And I've been doing that for many, many years. Uh, that gives me a sense of who I am, and as far as his self, that fits within this body and this kind of wrapped in this experience of life, and at the same time recognizes there's more in some way. And I nourish that. I meditate twice a day for 45 minutes. Um, and so who I am is um, it's in this moment in the sense of I'm I'm enjoying the experience right now of self-search in a sense, and finding words to say my experience is, and yet knowing that that is just this moment, and that there is something bigger, something more universal, and something I feel a connection with. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's kind of who I am.
Okay.
And
And you,
the interesting thing is, for me, when I started learning about Gestalt therapy, which was probably my junior year in college, a buddy of mine went off to Esalen for a 2 week thing and came back, and he was just sold. He and I were the two psychology students in our fraternity, and in hearing him talk and seeing the things he wrote about Gestalt therapy, and then realizing my undergraduate advisor had experience with Gestalt as well, kind of set me in that direction. My senior paper was on Pearls, Hefferline, and Goodman. So not that it was profound or anything, but I had exposed myself, and all of these, the spiritual, the physical, the emotional, mental, all of that dovetailed together for me in Gestalt therapy. So uh, eventually I was able to pursue that as a training.
okay. Just a little bit more before we get into more about you and Gestalt. I am curious, when you say, you've had these different life experiences, if there is a particular event or a circumstance that you would like to speak to about how it may have shaped you or affected you as a person.
Well, I don't know if this is the same question as who has impacted me. Is it the same question as that or different?
This one's about events or circumstances,
Events or
but those often involve people. So however
yeah,
you
well,
choose to
I'm
take it.
gonna jump into that one. I think it was my mom who was a devout Catholic, an Italian, nice Italian woman who was a child of the Depression, as was my father. Um, but also was just had such a huge heart, and it's touching me just to remember her. She died about 8 or 9 years ago. Uh, and seeing her her capacity to love and nourish and in some ways be selfless, in some ways not in such a good way, also be selfless. I think she had such a huge impact on me. My dad did too. He was kind of the opposite. He was more the engineer mindset kind of guy. A pilot during World War II, loved machining, technical stuff, and was very kind of socially isolated and in some ways inept socially. So uh, unless he was drinking his beer or whatever, he was more social. Anyway, so um, she was so accepting, so nourishing for me as a kid. You know, I'd have a breakup with a girlfriend or something, and she'd be right there supporting me. Uh, so anyway, she was really huge in terms of forming the kind of heart I would want to bring into the world, um, and I was proud that the education I got and the profession I chose made her proud, made her feel good. Another piece of my history, and I think you're going to get to this in another question in the future, had to do with having been an athlete and what that meant in terms of who I was, what was important to me, and ways that I needed to grow because I had kind of a narrow vision of what it meant to be me and to be a man or to be a boy at the time. So I'll leave it at that because I think you're going to ask another question about that later on. So,
Yeah, I probably will, depending how it goes. But okay, so that is the person who you would say would explain. But did any particular event or um, situation come to mind that you think, this probably changed me or shaped me in some way?
what would have been athletics? It would have been, I'm not a big guy. I'm 5'7". In high school, I was 140 pounds. In college, I was 150 pounds. But I was doing big guy things. And I had this sense of, I think, in some ways, of me being bigger than I actually was. Uh, I was a wrestler, I was a football player, a baseball player, and actually went to college on a wrestling scholarship and didn't last long. I just was not serious enough about it. But that was that was formative in so many ways about a kind of fearlessness, a kind of I can do this inner sense that gave me. Um, and I've since learned much more about my limitations and my way of seeing who I am in the world as well. So I think being an athlete had a huge impact on me. Also resulted in now 2 knee replacements. So
Okay. Yeah, that's a pretty direct impact.
yes, yeah. And my knees are so much better now than they had been for 40 years. So that's a good thing.
Good. Okay. Well, you mentioned a little bit that it was, through this other university buddy of yours that you got some information about Gestalt, but how did you then get more directly into Gestalt?
Uh, so I did that senior paper on Pearls, Hefferline, and Goodman. And it was years before I had some actual direct experience of Gestalt therapy. I got a master's degree, and none of my professors knew a thing about Gestalt therapy. It was pretty behavioral, pretty. There was a Jungian guy. I'm not Jungian. There was a Rogerian guy too, but nobody had any experience of Gestalt except there was a psychologist at the counseling center that I got a little bit of a flavor of it from when he was supervising me with some people there. Then in my doctor program, the doctor program, which was really an open-minded program, brought in Irma Shepherd for a weekend training of the doctoral students. And she was like watching Grace in motion. She was just so incredible. It solidified that I had been studying it, reading all along. I've been reading Gestalt therapy books, but never actually directly being exposed to Gestalt therapy, except in whatever uh, untrained version of my own I was trying to implement. Um, After my doctorate, I was in private practice. I was in Iowa. And I read a book called Focused Expressive Therapy by a psychologist at the University of Arizona. And I contacted him, and he was teaching his last course that summer. I went to this 2 or 3 week summer course that he was putting on. And his trainers started the Gestalt Institute of Tucson. One of them it was one of my group leaders. And so I started with the Gestalt Institute of Tucson after that training program. And then that was a 200-hour program. I got through that in 3 or 4 years, I guess. And continued doing trainings with them whenever they would be available. Moved away from Iowa, so I lived in New Mexico, began doing trainings at the Gestalt Institute of Phoenix. I'd already gotten my basic training, but they were doing advanced trainings. They had people teaching Zinker's model of couples and doing twice yearly weekend trainings with their graduates. So I did that for a number of years too. Just solidifying and being exposed to people like Joseph Zinker early on after my initial basic Gestalt training, and then did a week, or 2 separate weeks with the pollsters in La Jolla. Um, and then my first big Gestalt conference experience was the Images of Isidore, and I think it was '94, and I got to meet a lot of people. Not that they would remember me; I was one of hundreds of people there, and it just felt like this is where I belong. Like, this is uh, for lack of a better way of saying it, because I don't eat red meat, but this is meat and potatoes. This is just really um, uh, a fit for me in a sense.
Okay, so
And then,
I'm
oh, go ahead.
curious. Sorry, I
Mhm.
was going to say I'm curious what it is about Gestalt that has you most interested now. Like, what is the piece of it that you're most attracted to or most curious about?
Uh, the thing I think I'm most attracted, there's a couple things I'm really attracted to. One is its power, the power of the process, power of process. The other thing I'm attracted to about it is the the clear sense of self that we carry into the work with us that is essential to doing the work. It's how we learn about ourselves. It's how we foster growth for other people. And that's really, really not trying to do a manualized treatment. I'm not trying to do technique. Um, Technique happens sometimes, but it's about immersing into process and what that experience is like, and making that useful for the other person. That's real attractive for me.
And so, how has Gestalt affected or changed you as a person?
So, I was talking about having been an athlete and having a particular kind of culturally supported image of what a man's supposed to be. I think Gestalt therapy opened me up to a much broader me than who I would have become otherwise. Um, Opened me up to emotional expression and experience in a way that um, I really needed because of this whole cultural big boys don't cry thing. Big boys, they suck it up and do what they have to do. My dad was a World War II vet. Three of my uncles were combat vets during World War. So there was this um, kind of version of manhood, that the John Wayne kind of version of manhood that um, was and I think still is not. It's less for me, but in our cultural sense is limiting. Um, and one of the things I've been fortunate to do or be involved in is for most of my adult life, since I completed my doctorate and started practicing, I've been involved in different men's groups and different focuses, different. One in Iowa was different from the one in New Mexico, which is different from the one here in California. But they all revolve around being men together and experiencing something deeper, more profound together. And that's been really good. I bring a little bit of Gestalt flavor to that, to my groups. Um, but we're not doing therapy with each other. It's a support system more than anything. So that's been really good for me in terms of identifying as a male in a different way.
Okay. And aside from those groups, what has been your other way, or what have been your other ways of living or applying or using Gestalt?
Oh, I mean, I use it in my work all the time. In terms of my personal life, if I am in need of therapy, I usually try to get it from a Gestalt therapist, obviously, or I'll deal with something that I need to be dealing with. Missing that right now. I wish I, I wish that was more available. Um, uh, there's just a sense of depth of me that I wouldn't have. And I did a piece of work with Michael Clemens once, that was, I was just so brokenhearted at the time. And it was in a group in New Mexico when I was living there. That also, it's just like process Gestalt work. This is where being real, learning to be real is. Tossing away the images and the armoring and the need to look a certain way. That's
Sounds
how
like you, sorry.
that's how I redefine manhood. I think manhood is the courage to to deeply be who you are without artifice.
And that process of redefining it, I mean, that may be the answer to this next question, but I'm not sure. Which would be, what is one of the greatest challenges that you faced around Gestalt, either practicing or processing or organizing, or what have you run up against?
So I recently retired from the Veterans Administration. For the last 10 years, I worked for them. And bringing Gestalt therapy into an office that was not conducive to Gestalt therapy, despite the fact that these guys, and mostly combat vets, needed something where they could process the intensity of their experiences. And the challenge was to do that with them in a way that I could fit into the circumstances, that would be slow enough and uh, sensitive enough on my part that they weren't going too far too fast. Uh, and that they felt like I was really, really hearing them. And under the circumstances, that was a challenge. The VA is, like much of psychology these days, is very focused on evidence-based practices and wanting to get people in and out of therapy quickly. That just is not happening with people that have experienced the inhuman, the inhumane. That takes a long time. And I felt fortunate to be here. Rather, our headquarters is LA, and there might have been more oversight and more pressure to be quicker or whatever there than there was. I felt like I had the freedom to function the way that I do, both in individual therapy and in the groups I'm in. So I feel really fortunate to have had that experience. And it was profound and it was difficult. They're
Yeah,
difficult.
I've noticed that the challenges tend to sometimes bring up the answer to the next question, which is, you know, what would you say is one of your high points or your greatest memories? And
Mm.
often it seems to follow right in from the greatest challenge, but not always.
Is
So
this about doing Gestalt therapy?
um, people have answered it as clients, as therapists, as students, as trainees, or as human beings. So I'm curious about what one of those high points or greatest moments would be for you.
There are two of them, and they both happened with Vietnam vets. And they both happened. One was in New Mexico, and one was here in California. Uh, the guy in New Mexico was so angry. He had worked with a different therapist for 8 years, and she threw her hands up and said, "I don't know what to do with him." Sent him to me, and he was nitpicking. He happened to have a substance abuse counseling background. So he was nitpicking the therapy I was doing with him. He was angry at me all the time. If my seat was higher than his, he took offense at that. Uh, in the initial several months of us working together. And after the first session, I remember telling him, "We'll get through this. We'll get through this." I worked with him, I'm guessing 6 or 7 years, pretty much weekly. And he died of cancer related to Agent Orange. He died happy, though. He died without that intense anger that was driving him. He died making amends with, I think, with some family. He died with a more clear sense of who he was and um, what his contribution meant. And the Vietnam vet here um, described some just horrifying and uh, terrorizing experiences in Vietnam, being overrun by the Vietnamese army, a or by the North Vietnamese, a battery of uh, heavy armor stuff, and the amount of killing that he did, and the amount of shame that he felt about that. He, I finished with him 7 or 8 months ago, and he was uh, much less impacted by his Vietnam experiences than when I first saw him. I probably saw him for 6 or 7 years as well. I don't even know, but a long time. It was not a short therapy, and I'm so grateful that I I was able to have those experiences with them. So I don't know if that answers the question. Okay.
I'm curious how you would say that is meaningful for you, because it is very moving to hear you describe it. And I'm just curious what those experiences have meant for you.
It's even emotional to think about that. It's seeing the woundedness that human beings do to one another or expect from one another, you know, and feeling like there feels like something bigger with that, like something archetypal, something deeper, that with a few people I was able to have a big impact with. So, um, and the gratitude that I feel that I could do that, and the hope that it affects how we are as a culture in the future at some point with some people. I work with a lot of younger guys too, Iraq and Afghanistan vets, and the most, I think the most influence I had was in a group I ran with them, and just kind of the rehumanizing after that military kind of mindset, which they still hold, but they hold it from a more um, more accepting perspective of diverse understanding of what that is and what that means to people. So I felt good about that too.
Wow. And you've said that you've retired, but still, I do have the question of what else you'd like to do. It doesn't sound like you're sitting down to do nothing.
No,
Um,
no.
so what is it that you would like to do within Gestalt, or where would you like to see it go
Okay.
as a need?
Those are two different questions. What I would like to do is I'm building a small practice. I'm promoting myself, so to speak, as a therapist for therapists. And I've seen a few therapists, and they mostly come from the trainings that I've done here. So that's one piece. I'm going to continue to build the practice, continue to do Gestalt training here with 10 or 12 different therapists that are interested. I'm not developing a training program, at least not at this point. I've developed an outline for one, but I don't know if I have the energy or the horsepower to pull that off really without additional support. Um, and where I would like to see it go, because I'm a psychologist and that kind of mindset is there for me, because Gestalt therapy's research, and you may know more, there may be stuff going on that I'm not aware of, but research in Gestalt therapy that would highlight its effectiveness and legitimize its teaching, I think would be incredibly important. Um, if we had some evidence based, or at least research based, really good outcome stuff or whatever, process stuff, I'm not sure what format the research would take. But I think that that would really promote Gestalt therapy in the US. I think it's already doing well elsewhere. I think it's doing well in Europe. Sounds like it's doing well in Mexico. I don't know about Canada, but I do think it's in the US, at least in psychology. Psychologists are not coming to my trainings, not very much. It's mostly marriage and family therapists or social workers. But if we had some really, really good research that validated the usefulness of Gestalt therapy, I think that would make a huge difference in the future. And that my biggest worry is Gestalt therapy is going to die because, at least in the U.S., because
It won't die. It'll just become part of something bigger.
that could be too. Yeah.
No, I do fully agree that there's a lot of need for research, but I think you are right that it is happening. But I mean, the problem is if there are people sitting around saying that we don't know about it, things are not connecting properly. think they're a little too fragmented, I think, for our own good. Um, so
Oh,
that
you
kind of
may have
not
heard
really.
something about research more currently than I've found. So I'd
Mhm.
happy to hear about that and get some links or something because I'd love to see it.
Yeah, well, this may be late by the time someone sees this video, but there's the next research conference after we all survive the plague and the apocalypse and can travel again. It's going to be in Hamburg, Germany in 2021. So yeah,
Oh,
there's
cool.
there's a lot of stuff happening. It's an interesting time. But
Good, good.
yeah.
And it's
So I'm
heartening. Oh, go ahead. It's
no, I was going
heartening.
to ask you if there's anything that you wanted to add. So
It's heartening for me to see young people learning Gestalt therapy, uh, keeping it alive, which is really that's maybe it's not really an issue. Maybe it's my issue, not really an issue in the culture, but in the mental health culture. But that's my desire is to see it flourish and continue to grow. I mean, there's been huge growth in Gestalt therapy since the 60s and since the 50s and 60s. So, yeah, I want to see that.
okay. Well, if there's nothing else that you would like to add right now, it's been very nice to meet you. This has been one of these blind dates where a random person on the internet says, "Hey, I'm interested in this project." So it's been nice to meet you.
You too, Heather. Thank you for doing this and your cohort, Camila. I had to look at her name. I couldn't remember it. So thanks for doing it.
Okay, well, no problem. Thank you.